we're going to be discussing political polarization and, the potential for there being a second civil war. And that's not exaggeration, that's not me over fluffing things, yeah? We're getting some of the stats like in this video. You'll kind of see that actually this is a major problem. Even though I'm not an American, what happens in your election has fundamental effects on what happens to the rest of the world, and certainly the rest of the Western world is facing similar phenomena. So we're going to get into that in this video. So 80% of Americans are married to people who have the same political ideology as them. 75% of children have the same ideology as their parents. One would broadly expect that if you're entering a relationship with someone that like you have similar values, if you raise your children, they tend to have similar values. But this is where it starts getting a bit dicier when it's like, what would you be happy with your child like having, right? So in 1960, roughly 4.5% of Americans, yeah, so this is the average of both Democrats, Republicans, Independents, etc., right? Only 4.5% of them said that they would have a problem if their son or daughter married someone from the different party. That figure in today's figures is now a third of Democrats and half of Republicans would be unhappy if their son or daughter married someone from a different political party. So that's not good. That's quite a jump, isn't it? Now, part of why people are feeling this kind of intensity of opinion towards people of different parties is the political parties have like gone to each they've fallen more along ideological lines than they were in the period in like the 60s, right? In the post-war world, probably because like the nations had to like come together, like kind of, and so there was a sense of camaraderie and stuff. If you see the different political parties, whether it's the Conservatives and Labour Party in Britain, whether it's Democrats and Republicans in America, etc., they tend to have similar policies. They only differ on very minutiae or kind of like, or how, like they have the same end goal, they just disagree on some of the little things of how to do it. There'd be some distinction between people who are like more right-leaning and some people who are more left-leaning, but it wasn't as big of a thing. And also many of the kind of cultural issues that kind of came to light in like the 60s and 70s, yeah, this is what really divided people. And you'll observe this like in your own life. If you're having a debate with someone, like close friend or family or whatever, on economics, yeah, and you're arguing about the top rate of tax or about whether capitalism is a good thing or socialism is a good thing, etc., you don't tend to get such heated debates with regard to that, yeah. Whereas as soon as you kind of go into social issues tend to be a lot more personal and like everyday kind of things, yeah, like in terms of, you know, your stance on like, say for instance, gay marriage or immigration or abortion, or etc., all these kind of things, they end up being very polarizing issues, and it's a thing of, yeah, there's not really much kind of room for compromise as such with some of these issues. That's part of why we've seen such a schism. Just as like drill down with some of the data is actually right. So in 1994, 10% of Americans were consistently liberal or conservative. You know, and any like kind of like rationally thinking person, yeah, genuinely has some views which are left-leaning and some views that are right-leaning and some views that are liberal and some views that are conservative, right? It takes a certain type of ideologue, yeah, to be consistently one thing or consistently one another, yeah, and those type of people tend to then view anyone else who's even slightly to the left or right, like depending on who they are, right? They view them as being from the other camp. It ends up becoming very tribal and becomes very us versus them mentality. And you can see this with anyone who's on either end of the political, I don't want to say extreme because extreme is a loaded term, but people who are consistently one thing or the other tend to view everyone else as being in the other camp, right? So it's either you're with us or against us kind of thing, which is a very kind of two-dimensional, very kind of, it's not a very good way of looking at the world as such. But you know, so it goes from 10% in 1994 to 21% in 2014. So in that 20-year period, you saw the amount of people who are consistently one thing or another, like more than double, right? So now if we drill down into the different political parties, we can find this. In 1994, the average Republican was 64% more conservative than the average Democrat. And in 1994, the average Democrat was 70% more liberal than the average Republican. So this is something that you like broadly expect. One party is more conservative leaning, one more party is more liberal leaning. But there's many people, you have liberal Republicans and you have conservative Democrats. Again, even within like Britain and stuff, even though you have the Conservative Party, you still have many people in that who are quite like left leaning on economics and like liberal on social issues, and then vice versa with regard to the Labour Party. However, by the time it gets to 2017, we now find that 95% of Republicans are more conservative than the average Democrat. We find that 97% of Democrats are now more liberal than the average Republican. Like, what things kind of majorly cause this, And again, it is the social issues, It's things like abortion, but more importantly, you see attitudes to race and attitude towards immigration drastically shift, right, in this time. Prior to 1990, you find that both in Britain and America, etc., because this is kind of before the era of multiculturalism and stuff, kind of where it was kind of like this big celebrated thing. It was a thing of the populations were relatively more homogenous than they are today. Broadly speaking, people were like, well, we want immigration, but we don't want too much of it. And, in terms of like race and stuff, it's like, well, we've gone through the 50s and 60s and 70s and stuff, So all the kind of major obstacles that are stopping black people, for instance, from getting ahead have been removed, at least on paper anyway, right? So it's a thing of the attitude is quite a hard stance here, like kind of that a lot of like white voters in both places have, where they basically go, the reason why like there's crime or like unemployment or poverty in the black community, for instance, is because of a lack of personal responsibility. Like they need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and if they do that, then like they'll be fine. So these two opinions on immigration, that we want it controlled and we want it to be relatively low, and that basically minorities need to kind of like take care of themselves, rather than rely on other people and stuff, right? These views were like just common across both parties, right? Especially amongst white voters. However, when you get to like the 1990s, and you get to the 2000s, and especially by the time you get to the 2010s, you end up with these issues becoming more and more polarized within the different parties. So you find that Republican and conservative voters end up being more and more wanting tighter immigration and being more like pull yourself up by your bootstraps, while more liberal parties such as the Labour Party or the Democrats end up going in the opposite direction. They go, no, actually we need to give more support to people, and actually we don't mind if we have like mass migration. This is what you see with the Trump vote. This is what you see with the Brexit vote. It's this polarization. It's no longer really the debate being between left and right. It's more between like kind of nationalism / patriotism versus internationalism, right? These are now the new fault lines, and it took up until 2016 really for all these things which have been bubbling under the surface for a long time to really come to fruition, to really be like, actually there's a grand swell of people who, regardless of whether they vote Republican or Democrat, Labour or Conservative, the same type of people who are globally minded, who are internationalists and stuff, they are the ones running things. And actually, the more nationalist ones, the more patriotic ones were like, actually, hold on, our sovereignty is being taken away by this internationalism. We want to take back control. We want to make America great again, etc., etc. And so this is what we can clearly see. So now it's quite interesting that one can quite accurately predict in this day and age, what party people are going to vote for, and also what their stances on other issues are going to be. Because we see this rise in consistency in both parties, one can guess from one's stance on, say, gun issues, like on gun rights in America, with quite a great deal of accuracy, what someone's stance on abortion will be, what someone's stance on taxes will be, what someone's stance on immigration, like Black Lives Matter, all these kind of things, right? There's very little overlap. There's very little kind of things that Americans and British people, etc., have in common. It's making it more and more difficult. Like, as George Washington said, a house divided cannot stand. And as there's more and more of this polarization, as there's more and more of these two camps going into like separate things with very little overlap, it's a thing of, actually, what do people really have in common? Is this necessarily a recent phenomenon? Is this like the first time this happened in our history? No, before like World War One, World War Two, there was a whole heap of polarization, kind of like in America and in Britain and stuff. Issues don't simply go away yet, and it took until you have like these massive world wars and depressions, etc., that pull everyone together. This will sound strange. The only way I think we probably could pull together is if there is another massive war, and that's going to be at extreme cost, both in terms of life and resources. Hopefully, there's more peaceful ways in which we can kind of like break down these barriers, which we'll get into like throughout the course of this video. Also, another thing that people always talk about, they go, "Oh, it's the media, it's the media." This for me is one of the greatest chicken and egg kind of debates ever, whereby people go, "Oh, Brexit happened because of the Daily Mail. Oh, Trump happened because of Fox News, or this happened because NBC or CNN and BBC, you know." And it's like, well, let's think about this, yeah, right? This is not the Soviet Union. We're not all forced to read Pravda. We are not all forced to just listen to whatever propaganda's coming through the radios and stuff. People in a free market, you know, they vote with their feet, they vote with their wallets, yeah. If you're walking into a shop and you want to buy a newspaper, you're gonna read a newspaper that's gonna have opinions that are similar similar to your mindset. Like if you ever try and read a newspaper that has views that you fundamentally disagree with, you know, you should do that because it allows you to have a better insight into what different people are saying. But it can be quite frustrating at times. You end up pulling out your hair. You're like, I just want the news. I don't want all of this spin on it that I fundamentally disagree with. Because there's spin in pretty much all media, even ones that try and say that they're neutral. In reality, you have to kind of sift through. You have to like listen to both sides of the argument and stuff. And actually, the internet in some way amplifies this, just because it's such a free market that the cost to entry is pretty much negligible, right? And so people go, actually, I'm just going to get my news from where I want to get my news. And an algorithm predicts based on past behaviour, so they'll go, oh, you like listen to liberal stuff, we're going to give you more liberal stuff, and you listen to conservative stuff, we're going to give you more conservative stuff. Now, people criticise with the algorithm and say, why does it kind of do that and stuff? Yeah, the reality is that from a logistical standpoint, it doesn't make sense to, if someone is clearly liberally minded, yeah, and you start giving them loads of conservative things to try and balance it out, pretty much they're just gonna, a lot of people are just gonna be like, no, it's okay. So it's kind of a waste of time to a large regard. There's elements to which you could drop in little bits, you could drop in little questioners, little tiny things that make people question their things. So if someone's like more conservative, you could drop in little things that just make them question a little bit, and vice versa. If someone's a bit too liberal, then you go in little bits that make them have to question their own beliefs. So I think that's what it all comes down to in the end of the day. Like it's like what Descartes said, yeah, in terms of question everything, yeah, especially your own views. You know, if 75% of children have the same views as their parents, it's like, well, okay, how much is your political viewpoint based on what you've come to for your own conclusion? How much of it is just you going, well, mummy and daddy told me to believe this, and all my friends believe this as well, so it must be right. That's quite a juvenile way of looking at politics, but unfortunately, as the stats show, quite a lot of people are clearly just going with the crowd rather than actually stopping and think like, why do I believe this? I think that's much more of a healthy thing in the democracy for people to actually question their own beliefs. Studies have actually shown this, yeah. There's no evidence that the media is to blame for this polarization. Yeah, people watching Fox News are going to watch like something like Fox News anyway, right? If you got rid of Fox News, they would either consume no news at all, or they would like find something else which is more to their liking and stuff. But you can pretty well predict like how people are gonna vote, even from like where they choose to live. So for instance, 65% of Republicans want to live in big houses which are far away, which are spaced out and like far away from things, yeah, right? Because they like to have space, right? And 61% of liberals want to have relatively smaller houses, but they want to be in the action. They want to be like kind of like very close to different things. Pretty much what you're seeing nowadays isn't a thing of north versus south or whatever, right? It's now more of a thing of actually city versus countryside, right? And you see this again and again, like kind of in elections, like and referendums, etc., etc. You see that outside of the major urban centres, yeah, the support for many of these kind of more liberal ideas kind of fall very short. Rather than being kind of like the Rust Belt states, now it's not so much on a regional basis that certain places are battlegrounds. It's more like the suburbs are now the battlegrounds. Also, it's a simple fact that over the last like 40 or so years, yeah, trust in institutions have completely like collapsed and stuff. Prior to like the 1960s, yeah, not many people had televisions. Hearing things on the radio, there's only a handful of channels. You can present things in a like clearer way, etc., right? And it's easier to kind of mold a sort of narrative. When you have TV and people can kind of see with their own eyes a lot of the stuff that's going on, whether it's the Vietnam War or like protests, etc., seeing is believing it. If people see some of the more shady things that these politicians and other people in the, like institutions doing, yeah, it becomes a lot like easier to realize, oh, actually they're human beings. Like they're not on this mad pedestal. They're not morally kind of superior to us and stuff, right? They're flawed, and oftentimes many of them are corrupt, right? So because of that, plus with the age of the internet and stuff, right? Again, we see more and more of this. In country after country, the more that people have access to the internet, the more they start to distrust their government, they start to distrust lots of different institutions and stuff. It still is important to trust institutions, because without them, then it becomes almost impossible to live in a advanced society and stuff. Reading out some of the stats here, so this just gives you an idea in terms of how things have shifted over the last few years, right? So the Supreme Court, for instance, in America, right? In 1986, you had Justice Scalia. He was chosen by 98-0, so unanimously across the Senate. Yeah, he was approved, right? Moving forward to 2018, when you had Brett Kavanaugh. Yeah, he got through with just 50-48, and it was very, very much along partisan lines. And you see this in vote after vote after vote. Yeah, from like the 90s onwards, it becomes more of a thing of, rather than there being a cooperation between different parties and a bit of overlap, it becomes more and more of like, no, everyone's voting for this, everyone's voting for that, right? So for instance, like with Obamacare, yeah, 0% of Republican kind of congressmen, yeah, or senators voting for it. It starts to become very, very polarized. So for instance, trust in the presidency is now down at just 37. Trust in the Supreme Court, 37%. TV news, 20%. Congress, 11%. So think about it, yeah. What was designed to be the most democratic institution in the whole of the US, right, where it's, in theory, it's supposed to be representative of the people, and yet just 11% of people actually trust Congress. Meanwhile, the military and the police have 74% and 54% respectively of trust that people have in them. This doesn't bode so well. When countries start going down this road, I don't want to be apocalyptic with this, but it's a recognition that actually where civil society starts to break down, where things become more and more polarized, we start to see real problems, and we start to see real divisions, and we start to see real hatred and stuff. This whole thing of, for instance, never kiss the Tory, or people unfriending people, or relationships, like the people having divorces and stuff based on how people voted in Brexit or the Trump election and stuff. It's now starting to get to a point where it's like two tribes going to war. It's getting very vitriolic and very nasty, and it's not hyperbolic to say that it's heading towards civil war. America has not been this divided since the Civil War, and what one finds time and time again in countries around the world where they start going towards civil war, America is already at that point. It wouldn't take much for the election on Tuesday for things to majorly kick off. Depending on who wins, well, actually, regardless of who wins, I don't see it going in a very nice way. You're seeing at the moment, for instance, like what's going on in Portland, Oregon, what happened over the summer, like in the Chaz, something autonomous zone, I can't remember now. Things like that, and the kind of the flares up all across the country with different riots, and like, you know, there's a recent one in Pennsylvania. I stumbled over my words there. And then you got the Proud Boys, you got these people, you got it's getting very tense. And what I will say is, with regard to, say for instance, I don't want to like wish this upon America, but if we look at the Spanish Civil War, for instance, yeah, and how that started off, you had people on the far left trying to like impose things on Spain and stuff, and the military and many of the institutions within Spain were like, no, we're not doing that. What you end up having is the rise of the military, and you ended up in the end with Franco being the dictator. This is a common theme throughout developed nations. So if one looks at it, any place where communism has taken root, it's always been in largely peasant like societies, yeah, like underdeveloped, like kind of like largely agricultural societies. In any industrialized nation where there's a fear of communism or a fear of kind of like radicalism in general from the left, it always ends up being countered by a much larger, much more organized, and much more aggressive like kind of reaction on the right. And so I'm not saying that like, you know, we're on the road to fascism and stuff, yeah, but it's a thing of, if you think about it, every single institution is now not respected in America, and the only ones that are the police and the military. So if things kick off, who are the only people who are going to be able to bring order to the streets? The police and the military. How do the police and military lean? Well, they lean Republican. If it does kick off, it's quite clear which side is going to win. There's multiple different alternative histories and hypothetical things of like who would win in a civil war between Republicans and Democrats. It's not looking pretty for the Democrats at any point, right? So there's a recognition that actually any side that thinks that like they can kind of like antagonize it, and you know, and even if like Republicans and stuff, yeah, like or conservatives, whatever, you want to win, as Jordan Peterson says, you want to win the series of games. You don't just want to win one game, yeah. You want to keep playing so that you keep winning as many games as possible, right? If you go down the road of upending the constitutional republic, if you go down the road of completely like destroying what America was founded to be or what Britain was founded to be, it's a very Pyrrhic victory, and it comes at a cost of you'll never have what you had before. You'll never have the kind of freedom that you had before, right? And whoever ends up rising to the top of that is not going to be some sort of liberty-minded like person stuff, yeah. You're going to end up with a tyrant. You're going to end up with a military junta. You're going to end up with someone pretty much stripping away all the freedoms that you're now fighting for. So for both sides need to move away from the precipice, and we're going to get into how I think that the people can. But before we do all that, like the video, share it with your friends, etc., etc. Let's get this thing popping. Brand new whip just happened. I got options. Anyway, back to the point. So how exactly do we go about trying to like heal these divisions, right? This is part of the problem we have to overcome. In 1994, antipathy between Democrats to Republicans, so 16% of Democrats had a very unfavourable view of Republicans, and 17% of Republicans had a very unfavourable view towards Democrats, right? Now, in 2017, well, not now in 2017, by the time it gets to 2017, it's now 44% of Democrats have a very unfavourable view towards Republicans, and 45% of Republicans have a very unfavourable view towards Democrats, right? So where does some of these things start breaking down? 57% of Republicans and 67% of Democrats have a lot of friends from their own party, right? 55% of Republicans have few or no friends from other parties, and 65% of Democrats have no to few friends from the other parties, right? If you wanna know if you wanna be anyway, whatever. Getting too distracted now. If you wanna see as a clear example why these things are breaking down, if almost half the country has a very, very unfavourable view of people from the other party, the only way to counter that is to start having more friends from other parties. Talk to them about these issues. Don't just go on off on a huff. Don't go and unfriend them and stuff, yeah? Speak to them, debate with them, yeah? As long as you're dealing with good actors, you're not dealing with people who are lying about things, like who are intentionally lying about things, yeah? Because in terms of facts and alternative facts, those things do actually kind of exist, yeah? There are certain facts that you will listen to because they come from certain sources, and there's certain facts that you will dismiss because they come from other sources because you don't trust the credibility of them, right? So if people are saying things which are blatant lies, like they've been like fact checked and etc., make that point to them. If they still bunk it down and they go no, and they're refusing, or if anyone starts getting nasty, if anyone is purposely like saying something which they know to be false, yeah, but which pushes the narrative, yeah, these people are kind of bad actors, yeah. You want to still speak to someone, like you can, if you're a Democrat, you can still speak to someone who's a Trump supporter, yeah. If you're a Remainer, you can still talk to someone who's a Brexiteer. If you're a Brexiteer, if you're a Trump supporter, you can still talk to someone who's a Democrat or a Remainer and stuff, right? It's not that deep. Like actually have friends, go on dates, like marry people, have kids, whatever. Like broaden your horizons, because otherwise what you end up doing is you end up in a bubble, right? If everyone's just in a bubble and only listen to like one side of the thing, yeah, right? Some things you naturally will be like, I'm conservative on this and I'm liberal on that. But if you start just going into these bubbles, yeah, you'll end up suppressing things which you know in your head to be right, yeah, right, from where you're coming from, just because, oh, if I say that, if like I'm consistently liberal with everything, but I think that people should be able to own guns. And on a vice versa, be like, I'm consistently conservative, but I think that immigration's a good thing. You know what I mean? Like, this is not helpful. Like, kind of like, people need to be able to express themselves, to believe what they want, to like do their own research into things, and come to their own conclusion without feeling the need that you're gonna be excommunicated, that you're gonna just be cast off and exiled and stuff, yeah, just for having views which are like wrong views, yeah, like kind of like wrong thought, right? They can't run like that at all. So that would be my first and like probably best advice, yeah. Next bit of advice would be actually to challenge yourself, actually listen to different viewpoints, yeah. Do some research, like watch some of my videos, yeah. If you want to know about conservatism and you don't actually, if you're arguing about conservatism and you don't know anything about conservatism, or you're arguing about liberalism and you don't know anything about it, yeah, check one of my videos out about the history of liberalism or the history of conservatism or the history of da. Knowledge is power, yeah, and the more that you know about these different things, the better, even if you disagree with them, the better you're able to argue with it, yeah. If you can't understand where someone else is coming from and why they came to that conclusion and stuff, yeah, if you can't get that in your head, then that means that there's no conversation, then there's no learning taking place, right? You need to be able to put yourself in someone else's shoes. It's called empathy, right? Because otherwise, how are you actually going to actually be able to engage with them and actually learn for yourself and be like, actually, oh, that person thinks that way, I disagree with them because of X, Y, Z, yeah, rather than just like, oh, I just don't like them, okay? See, and the reason why we need to do this is because if we continue going down this road, yeah, right, okay, 2016 was crazy, right? 2020 likely to be crazy as well. Do we want to keep having this every 4 years, yeah, like where it becomes this fight to the death kind of thing, yeah, right? 2024, what's that going to be? 2028, what's that going to be, yeah, right? If we keep going down this road, it's going to be a thing where America is ungovernable, Britain is ungovernable, and then that happens, yeah, guess who fills in the gap of that? China, communist China ends up filling the gap of that, right? Countries around the world here which look at us with envy and with spite are going to be like, right, they're tearing each other apart now. Now it's time for us to move in. Now it's time for us to do what we want.